Today's discussion will be presented in three sections since we are recording this session for a radio broadcast on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. Our first section will focus on defining the advanced persistent threat and threat intelligence. Next, we will discuss understanding APT and threat intelligence. And lastly, we will examine improving upon APT tools and use of data. Feel free to post questions and comments during the session, and we'll provide an answer to you quickly. We are particularly pleased to welcome our moderator, Jason Miller, the Executive Editor for Federal News Radio 1500 AM. Let me turn over the reins to Jason to begin today's discussion.
Welcome to the show today. This should be an excellent discussion on cybersecurity and making better use of threat intelligence. Of all the cyber topics we discuss, I think cyber threat intelligence is one of those that agencies and industry alike are starting not only to grasp, but really see the potential value in how this information can be used to protect their networks. Our guests today are Bob Bigman, the former Chief Information Security Officer at the Central Intelligence Agency, Lance Dubsky, the current Chief Information Security Officer at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, Darren Van Booven, the Chief Information Security Officer and Assistant Chief Administrative Officer for the U.S. House of Representatives, Ben Rubin, the Director of Cyber and Information Security Operations at CGI, and Tony Cole, the Vice President and Global Government CTO at FireEye. Gentlemen, welcome to the panel discussion. Before we get started, let me set a little bit of context to our discussion. Threat intelligence, in many ways, is just another form of big data. But the difference is the value of the information is much more clear than any sort of just big data that an organization collects. At the same time, the amount of cybersecurity data coming into agencies or organizations is ever increasing, especially as the tools and sensors get better. The Homeland Security Department's U.S. Computer Emergency Readiness Team, or U.S. CERT, says agencies reported more than 218,000 incidents across the federal government in 2013. That's a 26% increase over 2012. Now, part of the reason for this increase is for agencies are getting better at reporting incidents, detecting, mitigating them more quickly. But it's also because the number of incidents are growing as nation states, organized crime, hackers, other bad actors are targeting federal networks and systems, and for that matter, contractor networks and systems as well. And agencies face a deluge of cyber threat data over the next year as they implement continuous diagnostics and mitigation tools and other continuous monitoring sensors. And agencies obviously are also getting better at detecting incidents. OMB reports that more agencies are using the Einstein software for intrusion detection and prevention. The initial deployment of Einstein 3A, as it's called, would address 85% of the known threats aimed at federal networks. Additionally, OMB reports that across the 21 CFO Act agencies conducting controlled penetration tests, on average, the network and security operations centers were 73% effective in detecting incidents, and over half of those agencies reported a detection rate of 99% or better. Now, this overall capability increased from 63% in 2012. So agencies are collecting this data. They're figuring out how to use it, but how to make sense of it, and more importantly, how to improve their cybersecurity. And those are some of the questions and much more we're going to talk about today at our panel. Once again, our guests today are Bob Bigman, the former Chief Information Security Officer at the Central Intelligence Agency, Lance Dubsky, the current Chief Information Security Officer at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, Darren Van Booven, the Chief Information Security Officer and Assistant Chief Administrative Officer at the House of Representatives, Ben Rubin, the Director of Cyber and Information Security Operations at CGI, and Tony Cole, the Vice President and Global Government CTO at FireEye. Let me start at the basics. We're going to start at the beginning in many ways. Cyber threat. We just, through my intro, talked about the number of incidents are going up. I didn't get into all the details in terms of how OMB broke down which incidents are worse. But let's talk about the cyber threat. How's it changing? How's it morphing? I'm going to start with Bob. You had 30, 40, 50 years of experience at CIA plus government, and now in the private sector. Give us a sense of what you're seeing.
So I'm seeing two trends. Number one, there's a dramatic increase in the number of very targeted, even more targeted than we've thought before, against financial institutions and institutions of interest to nation-state hackers, to the degree where they're doing incredibly successful cyber intelligence collection, doing very successful cyber intelligence analysis of how the organization's network is configured, knowing exactly what version of which antivirus software they're running, and then crafting very specific either APT or even a zero-day one-time attack against a specific individual, branch, or part of that organization. The second thing we're also seeing is the use of these same tech scenarios for application-level denial of service. attacks. Again, very sophisticated attacks against infrastructures, which through study and analysis allow them to install software in small parts, which will be used at some point for some type of denial of service or, God forbid, ransomware.
All right, so you're painting a picture that's pretty scary right now. It seems like the bad guys are getting a lot better.
Right, yeah. They're responding to the Einsteins and the increase in the government's ability to protect themselves against the large majority of attacks. Well, now you have to get better on the offensive side.
All right, and that perfect segue to Lance from NGA. You're nodding your head. You must be seeing very similar things.
Absolutely. Bob is right on. We see this great persistence in the social engineering and doing the reconnaissance piece and having these very targeted attacks. It's quite a challenge, and as the patching of systems, patching notices go out, the adversaries, whether they be nation, states, or hacktivists, are being very quick to decompose what those attacks are, what the patches are, and able to go and look at which agencies might be vulnerable to that. So it's definitely something that's quite a challenge, and you have to work hard to stay closer up in the hacker kill chain to prevent and detect, and to prevent.
Are you seeing the turnaround, hours, minutes? Meaning, as soon as let's pick on Microsoft just for a second. Are you seeing that when Patch Tuesday comes out, within an hour there's new attacks or new threats? Or can you talk about that?
Absolutely. So Microsoft is very concerned as well. All of the providers of software are concerned when they put out a patch, because they know that as soon when they put out a vulnerability and they put out a patch, usually the response time for some agencies and commercial entities as well is a little bit longer. So hacktivists who will work 24/7 to figure out how to use that particular vulnerability to exploit an agency, that goes quite fast, where agencies and commercial entities alike go through a testing process. They want to make sure it's not going to impact business or take down infrastructure. So that delay sometimes, that could be days, sometimes weeks, is a very exposed area. So we know the industry is very concerned when they put out a patch.
Fascinating. Let me turn to Darren from the U.S. House of Representatives. You get the joy of trying to protect, I think, 435 customers in many regards. Talk about what you're seeing from where you sit.
I would say there are three main trends that I see. First, I love analogies, so I'll use an analogy here. Plain and simple, I think we're in an arms race, and I think that Lance and Bob talked about this a little bit, but in the arms race, as you come out with new and more advanced technologies to defend your networks, the adversaries are going to develop new and more sophisticated types of techniques to target you, as well as the malware that they are developing in order to collect your data. And so I think that being in 2014 now, we've gone through a few years of some of the initial stages of development of some of these capabilities, and now we're definitely at the more advanced state. And the second thing is, in terms of multi-level targeting, something that we didn't used to see a few years ago, but we see a lot more of now, is that not only do adversaries target you via malware, but they'll do things such as calling you on your home telephone. They'll research everything about you when they're targeting you specifically. So they may hit your personal email address, they'll get your cell phone number, they'll call you up. We see a lot more of that with organized crime trying to extort money from your account somehow, because these people have placed malware on your home machine, and then they call you up and actually hit you with a telephone call as well, and that's something a lot of people don't expect. And thirdly is, to use another analogy, the transience or the limited time that intelligence is really of any value. And what I mean by that is, let's say local police get a tip that a criminal is hiding out in a certain apartment complex. Well, that tip isn't going to be of any value over the long term, but it'll be more value in the short term, so that the police can go and raid the complex. The cyber threats are very similar to that, in the sense that intelligence that you get may quickly change, and so the defenders need to act very quickly. They need to take the intelligence to be able to counter the threat as it is now, because if you act sometimes even as little as a few hours later, the threat has already occurred, and you may not be able to do anything about it. So, so overall, I would say just more sophistication of threats hitting you from a lot of different angles, and also the defenders need to respond a lot quicker.
Does the fact that so much of the information that the U.S. House does have out there is public make things more difficult or less difficult? Because if you're doing the phone phishing attack, which I have to say I got one the other day, and I toyed with him for about 5 minutes, and then finally I gave up.
It can be fun.
Yeah, it was a little fun. I'll admit that. Do you find that makes things more difficult on your end?
To some degree, the House, as well as the Congress as a whole, is designed to be an open institution to work with the public a lot, and we just have to work around that in terms of designing controls to counter specific types of threats.
Let me move over to Ben. Now, Ben, when there's a problem, sometimes that CGI will get called and have to come in, and sometimes you guys are seeing the problem first and have to tell the agency, oh, sorry, there's a problem. Talk about what you're seeing from a broad perspective with your agency customers.
I think it's been summarized fairly well so far. I especially liked Darren's second point with regards to the sophistication, where they're actually picking up the phones to talk to the victims. One of the, if you think back, maybe even just barely 5 years ago, one of the methodologies to counter social engineering attacks was, okay, well, let's ask for a phone number, or let's ask to speak to somebody if this is really who they say they are. Now, when you do that, a lot of the times you will reach somebody at the other end, and they say, oh, yep, that was me, that was legit. And they're like, oh, okay, well, I'll just put my password in then. And then that's the end. But I think one point worth considering that I think is almost on the other end of the spectrum from what's been mentioned so far is simplistic attacks as well. Because when you have all this sophistication, to tighten all of that down, you really start to have to weigh the balance between impacting business operations as well. And convenience is built into a lot of these systems for a reason, to enable people that aren't necessarily computer savvy to get their job done, to get it done easily. And so a lot of the more simple attacks may be effective as well when you start encountering agencies that have really tightened the screws from a more technical perspective. So something as simple as whether it be just an email phishing attack or something like that.
I was going to ask for an example of a simple attack, because phishing seems so, hey, click on this link if you want to see pictures of my kid. But
exactly right.
Is that still working? I mean,
absolutely. And the reason it's still in existence is because it's still working. Because you have all these, when you think of hacking in the movies and things like that, you see guys in dark rooms with computer screens all over the place, and they're banging against a firewall trying to get in. I mean, in a lot of the sense that never existed, but in a lot of ways where some of it may have been true. To certain degrees of government agencies and things like that, those days are gone. Given the simplistic operations or the ease of operations that I was mentioning earlier, if you receive a phishing email with an attack like that, it's going to leverage an actual function of your system that you would normally use as if you were working with another colleague that was overseas. And the attacker was just able to package that up as if they were one of your colleagues. And when you click that link or you send them that information, they are now trusted within your environment to maneuver around as if they worked for your company.
Interesting. Everyone's shaking their head. Tony, you get the last word of the segment here. When we talk about the threat intelligence and the changes we're seeing in terms of the threat vectors, what's the biggest thing you're seeing from your clients from as you guys are installing software and such?
Well, it's interesting, and I agree with all the comments that were made. I just want to point out a couple things. First, where we're at today, the problem is going to continue to get worse as we see more and more interconnected devices. I think Cisco's estimating 50 billion devices by 2020, from the Internet of Things. And there's a lot of challenges in that area that need to be addressed. And the other reason we're seeing this, huge upswing in successful targeted attacks is because the barrier to entry is very, very low. If you're a nation state or organized crime or hacktivist for that matter that has funding, it doesn't take long to build a level of trust in the underground when you bring money to bear. And if you don't have the expertise, you can buy the expertise, you can rent the expertise. They'll actually do the analysis, find vulnerabilities for you in software, browser plugins, applications, operating system, create malware for that, and then sell it to you. So that's the major challenge that we have today. This is going to continue to get worse because that barrier to entry is so low. So we're seeing a lot of impactful attacks, from the targeted attacks versus large, broad scattershot attacks that we used to see, 5, 10 years ago.
Let me throw this to the panel, but let me just start with Tony. When you talk about barrier to entry is low, are you seeing more organized attacks, meaning whether it's nation state, organized crime, or some other hacktivist group? I mean, Anonymous is the famous one, but are you seeing that as a different type of trend than some 16-year-old with a computer in their basement?
The largest concern today is organized crime on the financial side, ransomware, other problems in that area. So nation states that are stealing national secrets and intellectual property. And then I think a major concern for a lot of the federal, governments around the globe, so allies for the U.S., is, terrorists getting additional capabilities in cyber. I hesitate to use the word cyber terrorists because they're terrorists in general. If we see an upswing in that area, it could be very damaging because they're actually bent on destruction versus actually stealing. So the others just want to actually steal. So that's a challenge for us.
Bob?
Sure. So actually, I'm seeing a little bit reversed. I'm seeing a drop-off in the growth of hacktivism by instant totals. And if you look at the Verizon and the FireEye's own report and the types of attacks being used, you can see that these are mostly cyber criminals. Really good, well-inspired, well-supported, well-financed cyber criminals who are out to do one thing, and it is take your money. And they are, at this point, and it's always subject to change, but right now, what I see is they're crowding out the market. And they're even crowding out some of the nation-state market as well with some of their sophisticated hacks. There's so much money in this. I was talking to a person that in London. Their analysis basically shows that in a few more years, cyber is going to outpace narcotics and the amount of profit in illicit transactions. There's got to be a lot of money in narcotics, right? So you have to, if they're thinking that cyber is bigger, you can imagine where this is heading.
We had to take a break. You're listening to the panel discussion, Targeting Advanced Threats, Proven Methods from Detection through Remediation, sponsored by FireEye on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com.